Hello and welcome to another lesson of AP US History or US History, depending on what class you are in. Today we're going to be taking a look at the second half of topic 1.4b. So the previous video in this playlist looked at the Columbian Exchange, and now we're going to be taking a look at Spanish exploration and conquest in early American history. So as usual, if you're following along with the AP curriculum, we always want to center our lessons on the learning objectives. So our main goal is to explain the causes of the Columbian Exchange and its effect on Europe and the Americas. And then our curriculum outline also expresses to us the areas that we should especially focus on. So the Columbian Exchange brought new crops to Europe, stimulating European population growth. This concept was really more addressed in the previous lesson, the first half of this. And the improvements in maritime technology that also was addressed in the earlier video. But this part here, this is where we're going to be looking at more specifically today. Spanish exploration and conquest of the Americas were accompanied and furthered by widespread deadly epidemics that devastated native populations and by the introduction of crops and animals not found in the Americas. So we're going to do a quick review of this Columbian Exchange, and then we're going to dive right into the Spanish exploration and their justifications for conquest. So Columbian Exchange, this is what I call a VIT, very important term. This is probably the most important term of all of this unit. So it's important for you to write this one down, submit it to memory. The transatlantic exchange of plants, animals, and diseases that occurred after the first European contact with the Americas. So here's your map where you can kind of see the food, crops, and diseases that are coming from one region to another. And just overall those effects, Europe is going to hugely benefit in regards to power, wealth, and nutritious foods. We see new ethnic groups developing as we see our populations from the Americas, from Africa, and from Europe all creating new ethnic groups. We're going to see trade go from being land-based to now ocean-based. And unfortunately for indigenous peoples, we see conquest, disease, and death. And then, as we're going to get into in our next lesson, the transatlantic slave trade will begin as well. So let's start talking about Spanish exploration. Columbus had his initial voyages to the Caribbean, and that is going to lead to Spain financing many more. Again, their primary goal is going to be in search of wealth, but we've got our 3Gs, God, glory, gold. Now, they ordered that the indigenous people be treated well. However, there really won't be any monitoring of that for a very long time. And so the Spanish governors are going to ignore this in search of wealth, and the empire will become the most powerful in the world very quickly. Here's a quote from a Spanish soldier who says, "We came here to serve God and the king, and also to get rich." So let's first talk Hernan Cortes and the Maya. So Hernan Cortes is probably the most famous of the Spanish conquistadors. And so he and 600 of these Spanish soldiers are going to arrive in Mexico in 1519. They're going to land on the Yucatan Peninsula, which is where we're going to see our Mayan civilizations. They are going to quickly overpower them and take on women to serve as slaves and concubines. La Malinche is an incredibly important woman in American history and in the conquest of Mexico. However, she will usually not even be mentioned in textbooks. I encourage you to check out my other video in my section on profiles for American history to really dive into the role and the controversy she played with Cortes. But she is going to be taken by Cortes to be his mistress. She's going to be considered to be the mother of the mestizo race, but she will act as an interpreter. She knew Nahuatl, the Aztec language, and so she was able to really assist Cortes in his conquering of the massive Aztec empire. So when they go to the Aztec Empire, they are initially greeted with warmth, with opportunities for trade, with gifts. And some believe that this is because the Aztec thought he was their lost god, Quetzalcoatl. And so their initial interactions will be fairly positive, but then it turns more hostile as the search for gold, as the enslavement of the people really begins. And so the Spanish will eventually have to flee the capital city of Tenochtitlan. And this is where La Malinche is going to really be useful in helping the Spanish to ally with some of the outer groups in the region that were also being subjugated by the Aztec. So eventually, Cortes is going to launch a full-scale siege on the capital. It will be destroyed. The Emperor Moctezuma is going to be killed, and this is what really begins Spanish dominance and the creation of New Spain. So here you can see some images of Hernan Cortes and the Emperor Moctezuma. Here is an image that demonstrates the aid of the Tlaxcalan people of Mexico. They drew a series of images to commemorate the part they played in the conquest. So it's important to note, it's not just Cortes and his 600 soldiers against the Aztec. It is with the assistance, the allyship of groups in the region. A little further south with Pizarro in Peru, Pizarro and conquistadors defeated the Inca under the Emperor Atahualpa. And this becomes the second major outpost of Spain. And the primary purpose of this outpost is going to be similar to Cortes in Mexico, and it's going to be to supply gold and silver. So, what allowed for the Spanish dominance? This is a really good question because, as you could see, there weren't that many Spanish soldiers in comparison to the population of the indigenous peoples. And so, primary, absolutely, you need to know it's disease. Disease, especially smallpox, is going to really come before the conquest, before the armed rebellions. We're going to see that this conquest, or I'm sorry, this disease will wipe out the populations. If you think back to our previous lesson on the Columbian Exchange, 90 to 95% of indigenous peoples were killed from diseases spread by Europeans. And so millions of indigenous peoples will be killed even as this conquest is taking place. So disease is going to be the primary factor that allowed for the Spanish conquest. Additionally, advanced weaponry, the difference between steel and iron, which the Europeans had, compared to copper and bronze, which our indigenous peoples would have had. Horses, the largest four-legged animal at that time in the Americas would have been a llama. And so to see a horse would have been absolutely terrifying. Additionally, the cultural and religious beliefs at the time, like how the Aztec believed that Cortes was their lost god, and so they welcomed him in initially, which led them to believe that there was a friendship there. And so the element of surprise with these attacks was a huge component to the conquest. And then additionally, we cannot forget the alliances. The alliances that the Spanish made with other groups, enemies of the Aztec, were essential in the conquest of the Aztec Empire. So here you can see the Spanish Empire by the mid-16th century. It was quite large. So it really, we know Columbus centered here, and then Cortes came to the Yucatan Peninsula and then spread into Mexico. We see Pizarro here in the south. And then, as we're going to see on the next slide, various other expeditions continue to go into parts of North America. So the Spanish Empire was large and dominant. So other explorations, you can see here on your screen a variety of places: Florida, Texas, California. These places were explored, but not did not end up with the settlements to the extent of Mexico and Peru. So the conquest of the Aztec and Inca really led to that extraordinary wealth. But for the most part, most explorers were still interested in finding a more direct route to Asia. Asia still at this time is the place of the wealth, of the trade opportunities. And so most people are still trying to find the fastest, most efficient route to get to Asia. And so, although these expeditions were not as important, they did continue to fuel the spread of disease, conflict, trade, and religious conversions. So, these other explorations are notable in the fact that they did continue to spread these various things. So, the best way for us to look at how the Spanish justified their conquest is to actually read their writing, to look at the um, the documents that have left behind, to see how did they say it was right and honorable for them to subjugate the Aztec, to subjugate the Inca. So here's what Juan Guinness de Sepulveda says. And what's interesting here is just look at the title of this: Concerning the Just Causes of War Against the Indians. So how are they justifying it? The Spanish have a perfect right to rule these barbarians of the New World and the adjacent lands, who in prudence, skill, virtues, and humanity are as inferior to the Spanish as children to adults, or women to men. For there exists between the two as great a difference as between savage and cruel races, and the most merciful between the most intemperate and the most moderate intemperate, and I might even say between apes and men. So, clearly offensive remarks here, in just many, many ways, in regards to inferiority. But the Spanish really believed they had the right to rule because they were superior to the indigenous peoples. In the words of Hernan Cortes, I know this one's a little bit longer, but there's really some key elements here. This is when he's writing a letter back to King Charles V, where he's talking about how he is trying to not just rule them for gold, but really to convert them to Christianity. So he says, I say everything to them I could to divert them from their idolatries and draw them to a knowledge of God our Lord. Moctezuma replied, the others assenting to what he said, that they had already informed me they were not the aborigines of the country, but that their ancestors had emigrated to it many years ago. And they fully believed that after so long an absence from their native land, they may have fallen into some errors, that I, having more recently arrived, must know better than themselves what they ought to believe, and that if I would instruct them in these matters and make them understand the true faith, they would follow my directions as being for the best. So, this first half is really saying that Cortez is giving the people what they want, that the Aztec are asking for religious guidance. Afterwards, Moctezuma and many of the principal citizens remained with me until I removed the idols, purified the chapels, and placed the images in them, manifesting apparent pleasure. And I forbade them from sacrificing human beings to their idols, as they had been accustomed to do. Because besides being abhorrent in the sight of our God, your sacred majesty had prohibited by law, and commanded to put to death whoever should take the life of another. Thus, from that time, they refrained from the practice, and during the whole period of my abode in that city, they were never seen to kill or sacrifice a human being. So here he's connecting that their Christianity, their Christian beliefs that they had passed on, prevented them from acting in these barbaric ways of human sacrifice. So again, the Spanish are going to emphasize the religious elements, the religious conversions over the actual warfare and conquest that took place. So, to conclude, we are looking here at the learning objective, where we want to understand the causes of the Columbian Exchange and its effect on Europe and the Americas. And in this two-part lesson, hopefully you understand that the Columbian Exchange led to this direct transfer of crops, of diseases, of people, but that it had a devastating effect on the Americas, that it directly led to this conquest, the Spanish exploration, and the conquest, that the peoples were more vulnerable because of the effects of the Columbian Exchange, specifically disease. And that's really what allowed for the Spanish to come in with smaller populations and defeat these massive empires such as the Aztec. Thanks for joining me. Please like, share, subscribe, all of the above.